In a smoky frontier saloon, a weary mountain man wins more than coin in a high-stakes poker game. He's dealt the fate of a broken woman gambled away by her cruel keeper. Expecting rejection, she leans close and whispers, "I will give you a strong son if you keep me." Her plea awakens something in him deeper than desire, a longing for family and redemption. What begins as a desperate bargain turns into a journey of healing, survival, and love in the unforgiving wilderness. The mountain man had lived alone for 15 years, trading pelts and avoiding civilization's complications. The woman carried scars both visible and hidden, her spirit nearly crushed by years of abuse and abandonment. Neither expected their arrangement to become something real, something worth fighting for. But when her past comes hunting, would their fragile bond survive the test of blood and bullets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Broken Wheel Saloon sat like a weathered monument to frontier vice at the edge of Silver Creek, Montana territory, where the civilized world ended and the true wilderness began. Its wooden walls, darkened by decades of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey, had witnessed more broken dreams than successful ventures. Tonight, as autumn winds of 1882 rattled the windows, the establishment hummed with the usual collection of prospectors, cowboys and drifters seeking temporary refuge from their troubles. Ezekiel "Zeke" Thornton occupied a corner table, his massive frame hunched over a hand of cards that would determine whether he spent the winter in comfort or scraping by on dried beans and whatever game he could trap. At 43, Zeke carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived 15 years alone in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. His thick brown beard, streaked with premature gray, framed a face carved by mountain weather and marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of a grizzly bear encounter that had nearly ended his solitary existence. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing nearly 250 pounds, Zeke possessed the kind of physical presence that made other men step aside without conscious thought. His hands, large enough to span a dinner plate, showed the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent working with axes, traps, and skinning knives. Yet those same hands could craft delicate snares from pine needles or perform the precise movements necessary to reload a rifle in complete darkness. His opponent across the poker table presented a study in contrasts. Marcus Devlin, dressed in the expensive clothing of a successful businessman, but his pale complexion and soft hands revealed a life spent indoors counting money rather than earning it through honest labor. Devlin owned the largest general store in Silver Creek, along with interests in 2 mines and a freight company. He also maintained a reputation for cruelty toward those who owed him money or favors. "Your move, mountain man," Devlin said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education mixed with Western arrogance. "Though I suspect you've reached the limits of your resources." Zeke studied his cards with deliberate care. 3 aces and 2 tens, a full house that should win against all but the most exceptional hands. His pile of coins and paper money represented 6 months of trapping and trading, enough to purchase supplies for the coming winter, plus a small surplus for unexpected emergencies. "I'll see your $50, Zeke said quietly, pushing the money forward, "and raise you another 50. Devlin's eyes glittered with predatory anticipation. "Interesting, very interesting indeed." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a leather folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. "I'm afraid I'm short of ready cash at the moment, but I have something that might interest you more than money." "I don't need property or mining claims," Zeke replied. "Cash only, not property," Devlin said with a smile that made Zeke's skin crawl. "Personal." From the shadows near the bar stepped a woman who moved like someone accustomed to avoiding attention. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and clothing that had once been fine but now showed signs of wear and careful mending. Her face bore the kind of beauty that hardship had refined rather than destroyed, though her green eyes held depths of sadness that spoke of experiences no woman should endure. Sarah McKinnon wore a simple gold wedding ring on her left hand. the metal worn thin from years of unconscious twisting during moments of anxiety or grief. The ring had belonged to her beloved husband Robert, killed in a mining accident that left her drowning in debts she could never hope to repay through honest work alone. "Allow me to introduce Sarah McKinnon," Devlin said with mock gallantry. "She currently resides under my protection, having accumulated certain debts that require settlement." Zeke felt his stomach tighten with disgust. "You're gambling with a human being. I'm gambling with a legal contract," Devlin corrected. "Miss McKinnon owes me considerable money. Gambling debts, room and board, various personal loans. The arrangement has proven mutually beneficial." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her, but she maintained her composure with obvious effort. Zeke had seen enough broken spirits in his years of solitude to recognize both her pain and her strength. Whatever circumstances had brought her to this moment, she had not surrendered her dignity completely. "What's the value of this contract?" Zeke asked, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. $500, Devlin replied promptly. "Plus accumulated interest, of course." The amount staggered Zeke. Few men in Silver Creek possessed that much cash, and fewer still would risk it on a single hand of cards. Either Devlin held an exceptional hand, or he was bluffing with stakes he could not afford to lose. "That's more than I have on the table," Zeke said carefully. "Then perhaps we should conclude our game," Devlin suggested. "Unless you have other assets to contribute." Zeke considered his options while studying Sarah's face. She watched the proceedings with the detached expression of someone who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Yet something in her eyes suggested intelligence and determination that circumstances had not entirely crushed. "I own a cabin and 40 acres of prime trapping territory," Zeke said finally, "plus livestock, equipment, and supplies. Total value approximately $800. Devlin leaned back in his chair, clearly savoring the moment. "Acceptable collateral. Though I should warn you, Mountain Man, I don't lose at cards very often." The final betting concluded, with both men committing everything they owned to the outcome of 5 cards. Zeke's full house represented the best hand he had drawn in months of occasional gambling. If probability held true, he would win Sarah's freedom along with his own financial security. Devlin laid down his cards with theatrical flourish. 4 kings. The color drained from several faces around the table. 4 of a kind beat a full house decisively, leaving no room for argument or appeal. "Seems Lady Luck favors the prepared mind," Devlin said smugly. "I'll expect transfer of your property deeds within 48 hours. Zeke stared at his cards in stunned silence. 15 years of careful accumulation, his cabin, his land, his equipment, his entire life's work, lost in a single moment of bad judgment. He would spend the winter as a hired hand, assuming anyone would employ a man foolish enough to gamble away his livelihood. Sarah approached his table with hesitant steps, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know this isn't what you intended." Zeke looked up at her, seeing his own desperation reflected in her expression. 2 people caught in circumstances beyond their control, both facing uncertain futures, determined by another man's greed. "Pack your belongings," Devlin instructed Sarah with casual cruelty. "You'll be returning to my establishment tonight." Something in Devlin's tone made Zeke's jaw clench with suppressed anger. The implication was clear. Sarah's debts were paid through means that had nothing to do with legitimate employment. As Sarah turned to leave, she paused beside Zeke's chair and leaned close enough that only he could hear her words. "I will give you a strong son if you keep me." The whispered plea hit Zeke like a physical blow. In those 7 words, Sarah had offered him everything she possessed: her body, her future, her hope for children, in exchange for protection from a fate she clearly found unbearable. Zeke had lived alone for 15 years, avoiding emotional entanglements and the complications that came with caring for another person. He had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the pain of loss, that independence was worth more than companionship. Yet Sarah's desperate offer awakened something in him that had been dormant so long he had forgotten its existence. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet saloon. Devlin paused in gathering his winnings. Something else to lose, mountain man. Zeke reached into his boot and withdrew a small leather pouch that contained his emergency reserve. 20 gold coins saved for life or death situations. One more hand, he said. Double or nothing. You have nothing left to double, Devlin pointed out with amusement. I have my skill, Zeke replied. 5 years of guide service. Taking rich eastern hunters into the mountains, protecting survey crews, whatever you need. My reputation is worth more than money to the right buyer. Sarah's eyes widened with something approaching hope, though she tried to hide her reaction. The other patrons leaned closer, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than ordinary gambling. Devlin considered the offer with obvious calculation. A skilled mountain guide commanded premium wages from wealthy clients seeking authentic frontier experiences. 5 years of such service would be worth considerably more than the cash Zeke had already lost. 10 years, Devlin countered. Complete servitude. You work when I tell you to work. Go where I tell you to go, and ask no questions about the nature of your assignments. The terms amounted to slavery in everything but name, binding Zeke to a man whose character he despised for the best years of his remaining life. Yet the alternative was abandoning Sarah to a fate that would destroy what remained of her spirit. They cut cards to determine the winner. Zeke drew the Jack of Hearts. Devlin reached for the deck with supreme confidence, certain that fortune would continue favoring him. His card was the 10 of Spades. The journey to Zeke's mountain cabin required 12 hours of steady riding through terrain that grew progressively more challenging with each mile. Sarah rode his spare horse, a sturdy mare named Ginger, with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to long hours in the saddle. Despite obvious discomfort, she never complained or requested rest stops, maintaining the stoic endurance that had enabled her to survive months of degradation under Devlin's control. As they climbed higher into the Rockies, following a narrow trail that Zeke had carved through the wilderness over years of use, the last traces of civilization disappeared behind them. No telegraph lines crossed these peaks, no stagecoach routes penetrated these valleys, and no sheriffs patrolled these forests. They entered a world where survival depended entirely on individual skill, preparation, and fortune. Zeke carried a hand-drawn map in his saddlebags, carefully crafted over 15 years of exploring every ridge and valley within 50 miles of his property. The detailed charts showed secret paths known only to him, water sources that never failed even during the driest summers, and hidden camps where a man could disappear completely from pursuing enemies. These maps represented more than navigation tools. They were his insurance policy against a world that had proven itself untrustworthy. "How long have you lived up here alone?" Sarah asked, as they paused to water the horses at a mountain stream. 15 years, Zeke replied, checking his rifle's action while scanning the surrounding trees for potential threats. "Built the cabin the first winter, expanded it gradually as I learned what worked and what didn't." Sarah studied the pristine wilderness with expressions ranging from wonder to apprehension. "Don't you ever get lonely?" The question touched something Zeke preferred not to examine too closely. Loneliness is better than betrayal. Animals are honest about their intentions. People rarely are. They reached his property as the sun began setting behind western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no artist could adequately capture. Zeke's cabin sat in a natural clearing beside a year-round creek, surrounded by pine and aspen trees that provided both shelter and concealment from unwanted visitors. The structure itself reflected 15 years of careful craftsmanship and gradual improvement. What had begun as a simple one-room shelter had grown into a substantial 2-story log home, with glass windows, a stone fireplace, and enough space to house a small family comfortably. The foundation stones, each one selected and positioned by Zeke's own hands, represented the solid bedrock upon which he had built his solitary existence. Every rock told a story of determination, patience, and the gradual accumulation of something permanent in an impermanent world. Outbuildings included a barn, smokehouse, root cellar, and workshop where Zeke crafted the tools and equipment necessary for mountain living. A vegetable garden, now harvested for winter, showed the rectangular patterns of someone who approached even farming with military precision. "It's beautiful," Sarah said with genuine appreciation. "I expected something more primitive." Zeke felt a surge of pride at her approval, though he tried to hide the reaction. "Had to keep busy during the long winters. Building gave me something to do besides drink myself to death." Inside, the cabin's interior revealed the same attention to detail and functionality. Hand-hewn furniture filled rooms warmed by colorful rugs and quilts that Zeke had bartered from trading posts over the years. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books on subjects ranging from medicine to engineering to literature. A well-stocked kitchen suggested someone who took cooking seriously, while the main living area centered around a massive stone fireplace, designed to heat the entire structure efficiently. "Where should I sleep?" Sarah asked with the matter-of-fact tone she had maintained throughout their journey. The question forced Zeke to confront the practical realities of their arrangement. He had built the cabin for a solitary occupant, with a single bedroom upstairs and a small guest alcove that served mainly as storage space. "Upstairs bedroom is yours," he said after a moment's consideration. "I'll take the main room down here." Sarah looked surprised. "I assumed we would share. We barely know each other," Zeke replied, though he wondered if he was being foolishly noble. "Give it time." As they settled into an evening routine of preparing dinner and tending the animals, Zeke found himself acutely aware of Sarah's presence in ways he had not anticipated. The sound of her voice reading aloud from one of his books while he cooked. The sight of her mending clothes by lamplight with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making do with limited resources. The way she moved through his space without trying to rearrange everything according to her own preferences. "Why did you really bring me here?" Sarah asked over dinner. "Of venison stew and fresh bread." Zeke considered several diplomatic responses before settling on honesty. "Because you reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten." "Which was?" "That some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you." 3 days later, Zeke woke to the sound of approaching horses echoing through the mountain valley. He had spent the previous evening teaching Sarah the basics of mountain living, how to read weather signs in the clouds, which plants were safe to eat and where to find shelter if he ever became lost in the wilderness. Their conversations had grown easier with each passing hour. The awkward formality of strangers gradually giving way to something approaching genuine companionship. Now, as he dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats told him that their peaceful interlude was ending. "Sarah," he called softly up the stairs, "we have visitors coming. Get dressed and stay inside." She appeared at the top of the staircase within moments, already pulling on her boots, with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency preparations. "How many?" Zeke listened carefully to the approaching sounds while loading his rifle and checking his pistol. 5 horses, maybe 6, moving at a steady pace, not trying to hide their approach. Through the morning mist came a group of 5 men riding horses too fine for ordinary travelers. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothing, raised his hand in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture as they approached the clearing. But Zeke noticed how the other riders positioned themselves to control multiple escape routes, displaying the tactical awareness of experienced professionals. The silver-haired man wore an ornate pocket watch on a gold chain, its polished surface catching the morning sunlight like a beacon of wealth and refinement. The timepiece marked him as someone who lived by schedules and deadlines, a man who measured human lives in terms of profit and loss, rather than dignity and worth. Such men often proved more dangerous than common criminals because they wrapped their violence in the language of business and law. "Ezekiel Thornton," he called out, as they approached the clearing. "I bring a message from Marcus Devlin." Zeke's blood ran cold as he recognized the implications. Devlin had not accepted his defeat gracefully, despite their public settlement of the gambling debt. Instead, he had sent hired men to reclaim what he considered his property. "Sarah," Zeke said quietly, "get inside and bar the door. Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." The silver-haired man smiled as he dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Devlin feels there was some irregularity in your card game." He's prepared to be generous in resolving the misunderstanding. The game was fair and witnessed by 30 people, Zeke replied, raising his rifle to a ready position. The woman stays here. I'm afraid that's not acceptable, the man said, his polite tone contrasting sharply with the threat in his eyes. Allow me to introduce myself. Captain Reynolds, formerly of the Union Army. My associates and I specialize in recovering lost property for discriminating clients. Zeke studied the other 4 men with a soldier's eye for tactical assessment. They carried themselves with the disciplined bearing of former military personnel, their weapons well maintained and their positions carefully chosen to provide mutual support. These were not common bounty hunters or local thugs. They were professionals who approached violence as a business proposition. Mr. Devlin has invested considerable resources in Miss McKinnon's welfare, Reynolds continued in his cultured voice. He expects a reasonable return on that investment. Sarah's voice came from the cabin doorway behind him, clear and determined despite the danger. I'd rather die than go back to him. The simple declaration transformed what might have been a negotiation into an inevitable confrontation. Zeke found himself facing 5 professional gunmen, with only his own skills and determination to protect the woman who had entrusted him with her future. Reynolds consulted his pocket watch with theatrical precision, as if Sarah's life could be measured in minutes and seconds. Miss Devlin anticipated such resistance. He's authorized me to offer you $500 for your cooperation, or to collect a $1,000 bounty for bringing you both back to face justice for theft of his property. She's not property, Zeke said firmly. She's a human being who won her freedom in a legal card game. Legal is a matter of interpretation, Mr. Thornton. Mr. Devlin has connections throughout the territorial government. He can make your life very difficult if you continue to oppose his reasonable request. The threat carried weight in a region where corrupt officials often sided with whoever offered the largest bribes. Zeke had avoided entanglement with territorial politics precisely because he understood how easily the law could be twisted to serve private interests. Then I guess we have a problem, Zeke said calmly, though his heart pounded with anticipation of violence. Because she's not leaving. Reynolds sighed with apparent regret while his men shifted into attack positions. I was hoping we could resolve this matter like civilized gentlemen. Violence is so inefficient. Sometimes inefficiency is the price of doing what's right. The standoff stretched for long seconds, both sides calculating odds and waiting for the other to make the first move. Then Reynolds smiled and remounted his horse. This conversation isn't finished, Miss Thornton. Mr. Devlin is not accustomed to being defied, especially by mountain hermits and their women. We'll be back. After Reynolds and his men disappeared down the mountain trail, Zeke spent the remainder of daylight improving his cabin's defensive capabilities. He reinforced the door with additional timber, secured shutters over the windows that could serve as firing ports, and cleared fields of fire around the building's perimeter. Most importantly, he moved his emergency supplies and ammunition to secure locations where they would remain accessible during a prolonged siege. Sarah worked beside him without complaint, demonstrating familiarity with firearms that surprised him. She handled his spare rifle with competent efficiency and proved capable of accurate shooting at ranges up to 100 yards. Where did you learn to shoot? He asked, as they practiced together in the clearing behind his cabin. My husband taught me, Sarah replied, working the rifle's action to eject an empty cartridge. He said a woman alone on the frontier needed to protect herself, especially when her husband was working long hours in dangerous mines. As evening approached, Zeke climbed into the cabin's small attic space to retrieve items he had not touched in years. Among dusty boxes of old clothing and forgotten supplies, he found a battered wooden chest that contained the remnants of his military service. Inside lay a tarnished brass medal awarded for valor during the Indian Wars, along with faded photographs of men who had died under his command and letters from a War Department that had officially forgotten his existence. The medal felt heavier in his hands than its actual weight could account for. It represented a time when he had believed in causes larger than himself, when protecting others had been his sworn duty rather than a personal choice. Looking at the worn brass, Zeke remembered the young sergeant who had earned it, idealistic, confident, and utterly unprepared for the moral complexities of frontier warfare. Find anything useful? Sarah asked, as he climbed down from the attic. Zeke showed her the medal without explanation, watching her face as she examined the military insignia and Latin inscription. "You were a soldier. Long time ago. Different man, different war." Sarah studied his expression with the perceptive eyes of someone who had learned to read people's hidden truths. "The skills don't disappear, though, do they?" "No," Zeke admitted. "They don't That evening brought unexpected visitors in the form of Thomas McKenna, the trapper, who worked the high country north of Zeke's property. Thomas approached openly, calling out his name and displaying empty hands to show peaceful intentions. "Zeke," Thomas called as he rode into the clearing, "I bring news that might interest you." After determining that Thomas was alone and genuinely peaceful, Zeke allowed him to approach the cabin. Sarah remained inside with a loaded rifle, ready to provide covering fire if the meeting proved to be deception. "Marcus Devlin has placed a bounty on your head," Thomas announced without preamble. $500 for you, dead or alive. Another $500 for the woman, delivered alive and unharmed. The news confirmed Zeke's suspicions about Devlin's escalating commitment to retrieving Sarah. A $1,000 bounty represented serious money to most frontier residents, enough to attract bounty hunters and gunfighters from across the territory. "How many people know about this?" Zeke asked. "Word is spreading fast," Thomas replied. "Devlin posted notices in Silver Creek Butte and Helena, probably other towns too. You can expect company from professional manhunters within a week." Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway, her face pale but determined. "How do we fight an entire territory full of bounty hunters?" Thomas studied her with obvious approval of her courage. "You don't fight them. You disappear until Devlin gives up, or dies of natural causes." "I'm not running," Zeke said firmly. "This is my land, my home. I've invested too much in this place to abandon it now." "Then you're probably going to die here," Thomas replied with brutal honesty. $1,000 will bring some very dangerous men to your door. Men with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Despite Thomas's pessimistic assessment, Zeke felt oddly calm about his decision to stand and fight. 15 years of solitary living had taught him that some principles were worth defending regardless of consequence. Sarah had placed her trust in his protection, and abandoning that responsibility would make him no better than the men he despised. "Will you carry a message to town for me?" Zeke asked Thomas. "Depends on the message. Tell Marcus Devlin that he's welcome to come collect his bounty personally, anytime he feels brave enough." Thomas shook his head with obvious dismay. "That's not going to help your situation. It's not meant to help. It's meant to clarify the terms of this conflict." After Thomas departed, Zeke and Sarah spent the evening discussing their options with complete honesty about the dangers they faced. Running would mean abandoning everything Zeke had worked to build, while possibly attracting pursuit that could last indefinitely. Fighting meant accepting odds that would have dismayed professional soldiers. "I could go back to him," Sarah suggested quietly. "End this before it gets any worse." Zeke felt something close to physical pain at the thought of surrendering her to Devlin's control. "Is that what you want?" "No, but I don't want you to die because of my problems. They became my problems the moment I won that card game." The attack came 3 nights later, under a new moon that left the mountain valley shrouded in darkness thick as black wool. Zeke woke to the soft jingle of a warning bell he had strung across one of the approach trails, followed immediately by the muffled curse of someone who had walked into his tripwire system. He rolled silently from his bedroll and reached for his rifle, his military training taking control before his conscious mind fully processed the danger. "Sarah," he whispered toward the stairs. "They're here." Her response came immediately, proving she had been lying awake listening to the night sounds just as he had. "How many?" "At least 4, maybe more moving around the back." Zeke moved to the reinforced window facing the main approach trail and peered through a gap in the shutters. Shadows moved among the trees with the careful deliberation of men who understood their business. These were not the same professionals who had visited with Reynolds, bounty hunters drawn by Devlin's reward, probably local men who knew the terrain but lacked military discipline. A rifle shot shattered the night silence, the bullet splintering wood inches from Zeke's head. The attack had begun in earnest, with muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers among the pine trees. More shots followed in rapid succession, the attackers apparently hoping to overwhelm their targets with volume of fire rather than accuracy. Zeke returned fire with careful precision, his shots spaced to conserve ammunition while making each bullet count. His first target, a man crouched behind a fallen log, pitched forward with a scream that echoed across the valley. The second shot sent another attacker scrambling for better cover, clutching a wounded arm. Upstairs, Sarah's rifle cracked steadily as she covered the cabin's rear approaches. In her sewing basket beside the bed lay her mother's silver thimble, a delicate piece of metalwork that had guided countless hours of domestic labor in happier times. The thimble represented the feminine skills that had defined her life before circumstances forced her to learn the deadly arts of frontier survival. Tonight, those gentle hands that had once created beauty with needle and thread would take human life to protect the future she was building with Zeke. Two men coming around the barn, Sarah called down to him. Zeke moved to a window facing that direction and spotted the figures creeping through the shadows. His shot took the lead man in the chest, dropping him immediately. The second attacker dove for cover behind the woodpile, returning fire with a rifle that sent bullets whistling through the cabin's walls. The battle continued for nearly an hour, with periods of intense firing alternating with tense quiet as both sides maneuvered for better position. Zeke counted at least 6 different weapons among the attackers, suggesting a larger group than he had initially estimated. But their shooting was poorly coordinated, and several times they came dangerously close to hitting each other in their enthusiasm to collect the bounty. During a lull in the shooting, Zeke heard voices arguing among the attackers. Money was apparently causing disagreements about tactics and the division of rewards. Such disputes were common among hastily assembled groups of bounty hunters, and Zeke decided to exploit their disunity. "You men out there," he called through the shutters, "how much is Devlin paying you for this? Because I guarantee it's not enough to die for." $500, someone shouted back. "Split 6 ways, $83 each," Zeke replied. "That's what you're risking your lives for. Less than most men make in a month of honest work." "Shut up, Thornton. We know you've got gold hidden in there." The response revealed more desperation than confidence. These men were not professional killers, but ordinary townspeople driven by debt or greed to attempt something beyond their capabilities. That made them both less dangerous and more unpredictable than trained soldiers would have been. Sarah's rifle fired again, followed by a howl of pain and anger from behind the cabin. "Got one in the leg," she called down. "He's crawling back toward the trees." The attacker's enthusiasm visibly diminished after that success. Zeke could hear them arguing more loudly now, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Someone was urging retreat, while others insisted they had come too far to quit without the bounty money. A single rifle shot ended the debate abruptly. Through the shutters, Zeke saw one of the attackers fall forward with his arms spread wide. The others immediately began shouting accusations at each other, their fragile alliance collapsing into mutual suspicion and blame. "He was going to run," one voice yelled. "Take his share and leave us holding empty hands. You murdered him in cold blood. Better him than us." Within minutes, the surviving attackers were retreating down the mountain trail, their voices fading as they carried their wounded away from a battle that had cost them more than they could afford to lose. 2 bodies remained in the clearing, silent testimony to the price of greed and poor judgment. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, Zeke and Sarah emerged from their fortress to assess the damage and deal with the aftermath of their first victory. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the Canadian Rockies with a fury that transformed the mountain landscape into an impenetrable fortress of snow and ice. The first major storm dumped 4 feet of powder in a single night, blocking the trail to town and effectively isolating Zeke's cabin until spring thaw would make travel possible again. What had seemed like a tactical disadvantage became their greatest protection. No bounty hunters could reach them through the deep drifts and bitter cold that defined a Rocky Mountain winter. Ziller consulted his storm barometer each morning, an ancient brass instrument his grandfather had carried during 40 years of farming in Nebraska. The device could predict weather changes days in advance by measuring atmospheric pressure with mechanical precision that seemed almost magical to those who didn't understand its workings. During their isolation, the barometer became his most trusted advisor, warning of approaching storms that could kill unwary travelers within hours of their arrival. "Another big storm coming," he announced over breakfast, tapping the instrument's glass face. "Pressure's dropping fast. We'll have 3 days of heavy snow starting tomorrow evening." Sarah looked up from mending one of his shirts, her needle pausing in its steady rhythm. "That's the 4th major storm this month. Even for mountain country, this seems excessive. Some winters are like that. The mountains make their own weather, and sometimes they decide to remind folks who's really in charge up here." The enforced intimacy of their situation had gradually broken down the careful barriers they had maintained since her arrival. Sharing a small cabin through the long winter nights, they had learned each other's habits, preferences, and unspoken fears with the thoroughness that only comes from having no escape from another person's presence. Sarah had proven herself a capable partner in all aspects of mountain survival. She cooked with creativity that transformed their limited supplies into meals that actually tasted good. Her skill with needle and thread kept their clothing in repair despite the constant wear of physical labor. Most importantly, she had adapted to the rhythms of wilderness life without complaint or unrealistic expectations about comfort and convenience. "Tell me about your husband," Zeke said one evening as they sat before the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for special occasions. Sarah's face grew soft with memory, though shadows of pain lingered in her eyes. "Robert was a good man, gentle, hard-working, always believed that if he just worked a little harder, saved a little more, we could build something lasting together. He wanted children so badly he could taste it." "What happened to him?" "Cave-in at the Lucky Strike mine. He was working a double shift to pay for the land where we planned to build our house. The timber supports were rotten. The mine owners pushed the crews to work faster anyway. Robert and 3 other men died because someone wanted to save money on proper construction." Zeke heard the anger beneath her controlled words, recognizing the fury of someone who had lost everything to another person's greed. "Is that how you ended up owing money to Devlin?" "Robert's funeral expenses, medical bills from when I got sick afterward, debts he'd accumulated, buying mining equipment. It all added up faster than I could handle alone. Devlin offered to help, but his help came with conditions I didn't understand until it was too late." She didn't elaborate on those conditions, but Zeke had seen enough of Devlin's character to fill in the details. Men like him preyed on vulnerable women, using debt and legal manipulation to create relationships that resembled slavery more than employment. "Do you think about him often?" Zeke asked. "Every day, but not the same way I used to. At first, thinking about Robert felt like reopening a wound that would never heal. Now it's more like visiting a warm memory of something beautiful that happened once upon a time." The honesty of her answer impressed Zeke. Many people remained trapped by their past losses, unable to move forward because they felt that forgetting meant betraying the dead. Sarah had found a way to honor her husband's memory while still allowing herself the possibility of new happiness. "What about you?" she asked. "The woman who broke your heart in Denver. Do you still think about her?" Zeke stared into the fire, considering how to explain emotions he barely understood himself. "I think about what she represented. The idea that someone could love me for who I was instead of what I could provide for them. When that turned out to be false, it felt easier to stop trying altogether. Maybe she wasn't capable of loving anyone the way you deserve to be loved. Some people are so focused on what they think they need that they can't see what they already have." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to distinguish between surface attractions and deeper compatibility. Sarah had been married to a man who loved her completely, and she understood the difference between genuine affection and the calculated relationships that dominated frontier society. Outside their warm cabin, wind howled through the pine trees with a voice like a living creature in pain. But inside, they had created something that felt remarkably like home. The discovery happened by accident on a February morning when Sarah was organizing Zeke's belongings to make more space for her own possessions. She had been living in the cabin for 4 months, and their arrangement was evolving from temporary necessity into something that felt increasingly permanent. While cleaning out an old trunk to store her winter clothing, her hands encountered a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon and hidden beneath layers of moth-eaten blankets. The yellowed envelopes bore the careful handwriting of an educated woman, addressed to "My dearest Ezekiel," in flowing script that spoke of refinement and privilege. Despite her better judgment, Sarah found herself reading words that revealed the intimate thoughts of another woman who had once claimed to love the man now sharing her daily life. "My darling Zeke," one letter began, "Father has arranged a wonderful opportunity for Charles Morrison has asked for my hand, and his family's connections could secure your future in ways that mining or farming never could. If you truly love me, you'll understand that sometimes practical considerations must guide the heart's choices." Another letter, dated several weeks later, proved even more devastating. "I know this seems sudden, but Charles has convinced me that our marriage could benefit us both. He promises to find you suitable employment in his father's business enterprise. We could all be happy if you'll simply accept that love sometimes requires sacrifice." Sarah felt sick reading these calculated betrayals wrapped in the language of affection. The woman had been planning her abandonment while writing words of love, using Zeke's feelings as leverage to secure her own advantageous marriage. Each letter revealed more clearly how thoroughly she had manipulated his emotions while negotiating with another man for her future security. The final letter, written after her engagement was announced publicly, carried the tone of someone who expected gratitude for her cruelty. "I hope you'll come to understand that I'm doing this for both of us. You deserve a woman who can love you completely, without reservation or social complications. Someday you'll thank me for setting you free to find true happiness." Sarah was still holding the letters when Zeke returned from checking his trap lines, his arms full of firewood and his face reddened by the bitter cold. He stopped abruptly when he saw what she was reading, his expression shifting from surprise to embarrassment to something approaching shame. "I should have burned those years, he said quietly, setting down the wood and removing his heavy coat. "Why didn't you?" Zeke was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames might provide answers to questions he had avoided confronting for 15 years. "At first I kept them because I thought she might change her mind. Later because they reminded me why trusting people was dangerous. I suppose they became a kind of medicine, bitter but necessary." Sarah studied his face, seeing vulnerability he rarely allowed others to witness. "What was her name?" "Catherine Morrison." Charles Morrison was her husband's name, but she never stopped being Catherine Arlington in her own mind. Daughter of a banker, educated in Boston, accustomed to fine things and respectable society. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. Now I'm not sure I knew what love actually meant. I was infatuated with the idea of someone like her wanting someone like me, a mountain man with rough manners and uncertain prospects." Sarah set the letters aside and moved closer to where he sat beside the fire. She was a fool. Maybe she was practical. Her life with Charles Morrison probably turned out exactly as she planned: comfortable, socially acceptable, financially secure, and empty. A life built on calculated choices instead of genuine feelings. Zeke looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with lingering pain. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know what it feels like to be loved by a good man, and I know what it feels like to be treated as property by a selfish one. The difference is unmistakable once you've experienced both." Her words carried the authority of someone who had learned hard lessons about the nature of human relationships. Sarah had been genuinely loved by her husband, Robert, then systematically degraded by Marcus Devlin. The contrast had taught her to recognize authentic affection versus calculated manipulation. "Do you think less of me for keeping them?" Zeke asked. "I think you're human. Everyone carries scars from the people who hurt them. The question is whether those scars make you wiser or just more afraid." That night they burned Catherine's letters together in the fireplace, watching years of preserved pain transform into ash and smoke. The flames consumed not just paper and ink, but also the hold that past betrayal had maintained over Zeke's capacity for trust. As the last letter curled into nothingness, Sarah took his hand and held it against her cheek. "I'm not her, Zeke. I'm not looking for something better to come along. I'm here because this is where I choose to be." For the first time since her arrival, Zeke allowed himself to believe that someone might actually mean those words. March arrived with a deceptive warmth that melted the snow from south-facing slopes and coaxed the first wildflowers from the partially thawed earth. Zeke found a single mountain bloom pushing through a crack in the rocks near their cabin, a delicate purple flower no bigger than his thumbnail, yet brave enough to emerge weeks before the true growing season would begin. The tiny blossom seemed almost miraculous after months of white silence, a promise that winter's grip was finally loosening. Sarah discovered the flower during her morning walk and brought it inside, pressed between the pages of one of Zeke's books, her face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing small miracles. "Look what I found," she said, showing him the pressed petals with the excitement of a child who had uncovered treasure. "That's unusual," Zeke observed. "Most years nothing blooms until late April at the earliest. This winter has been strange in more ways than one." The false spring brought other changes as well. Sarah had been experiencing morning sickness for nearly 2 weeks, though she had initially attributed her symptoms to something she had eaten, or perhaps a mild case of mountain fever. But as the nausea persisted and other signs appeared, the truth became impossible to ignore. "I think I'm carrying your child," she told him one evening as they shared dinner beside the fire. Zeke set down his fork and stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, fear, and something that might have been joy. "Are you certain?" "As certain as a woman can be without a doctor's confirmation. All the signs are there, the sickness, the tiredness, other changes I won't embarrass you by describing in detail." The news should have terrified him. They were living under constant threat from bounty hunters and professional killers. Their future remained uncertain, and bringing a child into such circumstances seemed like the height of irresponsibility. Yet Zeke found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully. Sarah placed her hand on her still flat stomach with a gesture both protective and wondering. "Scared, excited, grateful, all at the same time. I never thought I'd have another chance for motherhood after losing Robert's child." Her words reminded Zeke of the baby she had carried for 7 months before fever took both her husband and her unborn son within the same devastating week. The double loss had nearly destroyed her will to live, yet here she was, offering him the gift of fatherhood despite all the dangers that surrounded them. "What about you?" she asked. "How do you feel about becoming a father?" Zeke had spent 15 years convinced that family life was beyond his reach, that his character flaws and circumstances made him unsuitable for the responsibilities of marriage and children. Now, faced with the reality of impending parenthood, he discovered emotions he had not known he possessed. "Terrified," he admitted honestly, "and happier than I've been since I was a boy." They spent the evening discussing practical preparations for the baby's arrival. Sarah would need better medical care than Zeke could provide, which meant establishing contact with the doctor in Silver Creek, despite the ongoing bounty on their heads. They would need to expand the cabin's living space and accumulate supplies for infant care. Most importantly, they would need to resolve the conflict with Devlin before their child was born into a world where enemies stalked their family. "We can't raise a baby while running from killers," Sarah said with characteristic directness. "This has to end, one way or another." Zeke nodded grimly. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing. Once the snow melts enough for travel, we'll need to take the fight to Devlin instead of waiting for him to send more men after us." The prospect of leaving their mountain fortress to confront their enemies in town filled both of them with apprehension. Here, they controlled the terrain and knew every defensive advantage. In Silver Creek, they would be vulnerable to attack from any direction, surrounded by people who might collect bounty money or simply step aside while others did the killing. But pregnancy changed everything. Sarah would need medical attention during the later months, and their child would require safety and stability that could never exist while Devlin's bounty remained in effect. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sarah said hesitantly. About us. About what this baby means for our arrangement." Zeke understood her concern. Their relationship had evolved from a desperate bargain into genuine affection, but they had never formally acknowledged their feelings or made commitments about the future. A child would bind them together for life, regardless of whether their romantic relationship survived. "What do you want it to mean?" he asked. "I want us to be a real family, not because circumstances forced us together, but because we choose each other every day." Zeke reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. "I've been wanting to say something like that for months, but I was afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of your situation. And I was afraid you'd think I was trying to trap you with pregnancy." They laughed at the absurdity of their mutual fears, two people who had been dancing around their feelings while both desperately wanted the same thing. When the mountain passes finally cleared enough for travel, Zeke made his first trip to Silver Creek since the winter storms had trapped them in their sanctuary. The town showed signs of the harsh season. Several buildings had collapsed under snow loads, and the main street was a muddy quagmire of melting ice and horse manure. But what caught his attention immediately was the profusion of official notices posted on every available surface. Wanted posters bearing crude drawings of his face, and Sarah's covered the sides of buildings, fence posts, and even the door of the church. The bounty had increased to $1,500 for both of them, and the charges had expanded beyond simple theft to include murder, arson, and harboring a known criminal. Marcus Devlin had apparently decided that legal subtlety was less important than result. The poster showed their faces rendered in the stark black ink of official condemnation, transforming them from private citizens into public enemies whose capture would benefit the entire community. Such documents carried weight in frontier society, where printed accusations often became accepted truth regardless of evidence or due process. "Quite a collection, isn't it?" came a familiar voice from behind him. Zeke turned to find Thomas McKenna, approaching with the cautious manner of someone who knew he was taking risks by associating with wanted criminals. The trapper's weathered face showed concern, mixed with something that might have been admiration. "Devlin's been busy during the winter," Thomas continued, nodding toward the wanted posters. "Must have spent half his fortune on printing and distribution. These things are posted from here to Denver, and I heard tell they've reached as far as San Francisco." "Any takers?" Zeke asked. "More than you'd wanted to about. Professional manhunters started arriving 2 weeks ago. Soon as the passes opened, they're staying at the hotel, drinking at the saloon, and asking questions about mountain trails and cabin locations." The news was worse than Zeke had feared. A localized bounty might have attracted only opportunistic locals and regional criminals, but national distribution would bring experienced professionals who made their living tracking down wanted men regardless of innocence or guilt. "There's something else," Thomas added, lowering his voice. "Devlin's been talking to territorial officials. Claims you and the woman are part of a larger criminal organization operating out of the mountains. Says you've been robbing supply trains and murdering travelers. Anyone believe that nonsense? Enough people to matter. Fear makes folks willing to accept simple explanations for complicated problems. And Devlin's been generous with his donations to local politicians." Zeke absorbed this information while studying the wanted poster more carefully. The charges were crafted to justify lethal force by any citizen or law enforcement officer who encountered them. Devlin had transformed their personal conflict into a public crusade against dangerous criminals. "How many bounty hunters?" Zeke asked. "8 that I've seen personally, probably more operating quietly or arriving later. These are serious men, Zeke, professional killers with experience hunting human prey." The description matched Zeke's worst fears. Unlike the disorganized local troublemakers they had fought off during the winter, professional bounty hunters would approach their task with military precision and adequate resources. They would study the terrain, identify weaknesses in the cabin's defenses, and coordinate their attack to maximize success while minimizing their own casualties. What about town sentiment? Anyone questioning Devlin's story? Thomas glanced around nervously before responding. Some folks remember that card game differently than Devlin tells it now. But they're keeping quiet, because speaking up might make them targets too. Fear has a way of silencing honest voices. Zeke understood the dynamics at work. Devlin possessed enough wealth and political connections to destroy anyone who challenged his version of events. In a community dependent on his business enterprises for economic survival, few people would risk their livelihoods to defend strangers they barely knew. There is one piece of good news, Thomas added. Doc Harrison has been asking questions about you and Sarah. He seems to think there might be more to this story than what Devlin's spreading around. Jonathan Harrison was Silver Creek's only physician, a man whose medical training and moral convictions commanded respect throughout the territory. If he was questioning Devlin's narrative, it suggested that at least some community leaders remained skeptical of the official accusations. Why would the doctor care about our situation? Hard to say, but he's been treating some of the men who survived that attack on your cabin last fall. Seems their stories don't match what Devlin's been telling people about you being cold-blooded killers. This revelation offered a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark situation. Wounded survivors might provide testimony about the true nature of the conflict, revealing that Zeke and Sarah had been defending themselves rather than initiating violence. Can you get a message to him? Zeke asked. Risky, but probably possible. What do you want me to tell him? That we're willing to meet with him, somewhere private where we can tell our side of the story. But he needs to understand that talking to us could put him in danger too. Thomas nodded grimly. I'll see what I can arrange. But Zeke, you need to know that time is running out. These bounty hunters aren't going to wait much longer before they come for you. The message came through Thomas McKenna 3 days later, delivered with the urgent whisper of a man who understood the deadly nature of the game being played. Harrison was willing to meet, but the bounty hunters had taken a hostage to force Zeke's surrender. The 8-year-old son of a widow who had spoken favorably about Sarah's character to anyone who would listen. They've got young Billy Henderson, Thomas reported, as he stood in the cabin doorway, snow still clinging to his coat from the desperate ride up the mountain. Grabbed him yesterday morning on his way to school. His mother, Maria, tried to fight them off with a kitchen knife, but there were too many of them. Sarah felt her blood turn cold at the news. She had met Maria Henderson during her few visits to town before the bounty was posted, a kind woman struggling to raise her son alone after her husband died in a logging accident. The thought of that innocent child being used as leverage in their conflict made her physically sick.
What are their demands? Zeke asked,
though his grim expression suggested he already knew the answer. You and Sarah surrender yourselves by noon tomorrow, or they start cutting pieces off the boy. They've set up in the old mining camp east of town, where they can control all the approaches and see anyone coming from miles away. Zeke studied his hand-drawn maps of the area, calculating distances and tactical options with the methodical precision of his military training. The mining camp occupied a defensible position on high ground, surrounded by open terrain that would expose any rescue attempt to devastating crossfire. Even with surprise and superior marksmanship, the odds of saving the child while eliminating all the threats were virtually impossible. It's a trap, Sarah said quietly. They know you won't abandon an innocent child to save yourself. Of course it's a trap, but that doesn't change what we have to do. Sarah moved to her sewing basket and withdrew her mother's scissors, sharp steel blades that had served countless domestic purposes throughout her life. The familiar weight of the tools felt different now, transformed by necessity from instruments of creation into potential weapons of survival. She had learned during their winter isolation that even the most innocent objects could become deadly when wielded with sufficient determination. There might be another way, she said, testing the scissors' edges against her thumb. Something they won't expect because they think of me as helpless baggage rather than an equal partner. Zeke looked at her with growing alarm. Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no. You're carrying our child, and I won't risk both of you for any reason. Listen to me, Sarah insisted, moving closer and taking his hands in hers. They want both of us, but they expect you to be the primary threat. A pregnant woman with sewing scissors doesn't register as dangerous to men like that. Because it's not dangerous. It's suicide. Not if we plan it correctly. I could approach their camp openly, claiming to be ready to surrender in exchange for the boy's safety. While they're focused on me, you could work around to a better position. Thomas shook his head with obvious dismay. Sarah, these are professional killers we're talking about. They won't hesitate to shoot a pregnant woman if they think she poses any threat at all. Then we make sure they don't see me as a threat until it's too late. The plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming was impossibly complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and flawless execution from people who had never attempted anything remotely similar. Sarah would approach the mining camp alone, carrying a white flag and claiming to be seeking terms for their surrender. While the bounty hunters were distracted by negotiations, Zeke would use his knowledge of the terrain to position himself for a coordinated attack. If this goes wrong, we all die, Zeke warned, as they made final preparations. You, me, the baby, and probably the Henderson boy too. If we do nothing, Billy dies for certain, and we spend the rest of our lives running from one set of killers after another. At least this way, we have a chance to end it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant objects appear deceptively close. Sarah dressed in her simplest clothing and braided her hair in a style that emphasized her youth and supposed vulnerability. She concealed the scissors in a sheath sewn into her dress, positioned where they would be accessible but invisible to casual observation. Remember, Zeke told her as they prepared to separate, your job is to create confusion, not to be a hero. Get them focused on you, then get out of the way so I can do what needs to be done. And your job is to make sure we all go home alive, Sarah replied, kissing him with the fierce intensity of someone who knew this might be their final moment together. As she walked away from their cabin toward the mining camp and the confrontation that would determine their future, Sarah felt the baby move inside her for the first time, a tiny flutter of life that strengthened her resolve to fight for the world she wanted that child to inherit. The mining camp erupted in chaos as Sarah's desperate gambit unfolded with deadly precision. Her scissors had found their mark in the neck of the bounty hunter, holding Billy Henderson, while Zeke's rifle fire from the surrounding rocks eliminated 2 more of their captors within seconds. But the rescue came at a terrible cost. A ricocheting bullet caught Sarah in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground beside the terrified child she had risked everything to save. Sarah, Zeke's voice carried across the camp as he emerged from his concealment, rifle still scumming from the final shots that had ended the brief but vicious firefight. Billy Henderson, miraculously unharmed but traumatized by the violence he had witnessed, clung to Sarah's uninjured arm while she struggled to maintain consciousness. Blood seeped through her dress from the wound, but her eyes remained clear and determined. The boy's safe, she whispered as Zeke knelt beside her. That's what matters, but their problems were far from over. Among the belongings scattered by the dead bounty hunters, Zeke discovered a leather-bound ledger that would change everything they thought they knew about Marcus Devlin's motivation. The book contained detailed records of financial transactions that revealed crimes far more serious than simple greed or wounded pride. The ledger documented systematic embezzlement from Silver Creek's bank, falsified mining claims that had defrauded legitimate prospectors, and kickbacks from territorial officials who had been purchased with money stolen from the community's trust fund. Devlin had been operating a criminal enterprise that affected nearly every family in the region, using his legitimate businesses as cover for activities that amounted to large-scale theft from his own neighbors. Look at this, Zeke said, showing Sarah pages of entries that documented bribes to territorial judges, payments to false witnesses, and fees for forged legal documents. He's been stealing from the entire town for years. Most damaging of all were the entries related to Sarah's situation. The ledger revealed that her husband's debts had been deliberately inflated through fraudulent interest calculations and fabricated expenses. Robert McKinnon had actually died owing less than $50, but Devlin had systematically increased that amount through illegal accounting practices until it became the crushing burden that had trapped his widow. "He murdered my husband," Sarah said with quiet fury as she read the relevant entries. "Not directly, but he bribed mine inspectors to ignore safety violations. Robert died because Devlin wanted to save money on proper timber supply." The revelation transformed their conflict from a personal dispute into something approaching a community crusade. Devlin hadn't just wronged them. He had been systematically victimizing everyone in Silver Creek while presenting himself as a pillar of respectable society. "This explains why he's so desperate to eliminate us." Zeke realized, "We're not just inconvenient witnesses to his treatment of you. We've become symbols of resistance that could inspire others to question his version of events." Billy Henderson, who had been listening to their conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities, spoke up with surprising clarity. "My ma says Mr. Devlin cheated us out of our house after Pa died. She says he changes the numbers in his books to make people owe more money than they really borrowed." The boy's innocent testimony confirmed what the ledger had documented in cold figures. Devlin had been preying on widows and vulnerable families throughout the territory, using legal manipulation and financial fraud to acquire property and resources at far below their actual value. "How many other families has he destroyed?" Sarah asked, struggling to sit up despite her wound. Zeke helped her into a more comfortable position while studying the ledger's extensive records. "Dozens at least. Maybe more. He's been running this operation for years, and it looks like he has collaborators in the territorial government who help legitimize his thefts." The magnitude of Devlin's crimes made their personal struggle seem almost insignificant by comparison. Yet it also provided them with something they had desperately needed: allies who had their own reasons to want Devlin exposed and punished. "We need to get this information to Doc Harrison," Sarah said, "and to anyone else in town who has the courage to stand up to Devlin once they understand what he's really been doing." But first, they needed to get Sarah to medical attention before her wound became infected or caused complications with her pregnancy. The bullet had passed through her shoulder without hitting major arteries, but frontier medicine offered limited options for treating such injuries safely. "Can you ride?" Zeke asked, as he fashioned a makeshift bandage from torn cloth. "I can do whatever needs to be done," Sarah replied with characteristic determination. "This ends now, one way or another." As they prepared to leave the mining camp with Billy Henderson and the evidence that could finally expose Devlin's true nature, all three understood that they were no longer running from their enemies. For the first time since this conflict began, they were taking the fight directly to the man who had caused so much suffering for so many innocent people. The ledger in Zeke's hands represented more than evidence of criminal activity. It was the key to justice for an entire community that had been systematically victimized by a man they had trusted with their financial security and civic leadership. The main street of Silver Creek had never seen anything like the confrontation that unfolded on that April morning. Word of the ledger's contents had spread through town like wildfire, carried by Doc Harrison and other community leaders who had finally found the courage to challenge Marcus Devlin's version of events. Citizens emerged from shops and houses to witness what many understood would be the final resolution of a conflict that had consumed their community for months. Zeke stood in the center of the muddy street, his father's pistol holstered at his side. The same weapon that had killed his abusive father 25 years earlier, when young Ezekiel had finally found the courage to defend his mother from the man who had terrorized their household. The gun represented both protection and the terrible burden of violence that seemed to follow certain families from generation to generation. Today, Zeke would discover whether he could break that cycle or simply perpetuate it under different circumstances. Sarah remained at Harrison's clinic, her shoulder wound healing but her condition too fragile for the physical demands of a gunfight. Billy Henderson sat beside her bed, having appointed himself her protector, while his mother worked with other townspeople to organize support for the confrontation that everyone knew was inevitable. Thornton, Devlin's voice carried clearly across the street as he emerged from his store with Captain Reynolds and 3 other hired guns flanking him. "You've caused enough trouble for this community. Time to settle this like men." "I couldn't agree more," Zeke replied, his hand resting casually near his gun butt. "Though I suspect we have different definitions of what constitutes honorable behavior." Harrison stepped onto the clinic's front porch, the leather ledger held prominently in his hands where everyone could see it. "Before anyone starts shooting, this community deserves to hear the truth about what's been happening in our town. The only truth that matters is that Thornton is a wanted criminal who kidnapped an innocent woman," Devlin replied, though his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed in previous confrontations. "According to this ledger, the only criminals in Silver Creek have been wearing respectable clothing and hiding behind legal documents." Dr. Harrison announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear clearly. "Marcus Devlin has been systematically stealing from every family in this community for over 5 years. A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to understand the implications of the doctor's words. Maria Henderson stepped forward, her son's rescue having given her courage to speak publicly about her own experiences with Devlin's business practices. "He cheated us out of our house," she declared, "tripled the amount my husband owed through fake interest charges and made up fee when I couldn't pay. He took our home and forced us to rent it back from him at twice what we could afford." Other voices joined hers as citizens found the strength to share their own stories of financial manipulation and legal fraud. The pattern became clear. Devlin had been preying on the most vulnerable members of their community while presenting himself as their benefactor and protector. "Please," Devlin snarled, but his hired guns were beginning to look uncertain as they realized that public opinion was shifting decisively against their employer. Captain Reynolds, ever the professional soldier, assessed the tactical situation with growing concern. Fighting a few mountain hermits was one thing, but shooting down citizens in their own town square was quite another. Such actions would bring territorial and federal authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of their employment. "Miss Devlin," Reynolds said quietly, "perhaps we should reconsider our position here." "We finish this now," Devlin replied, drawing his pistol with the desperate fury of a man who understood that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. The gunfight that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but would be remembered in Silver Creek for generations. Devlin's first shot went wide, his hand shaking with rage and desperation. Zeke's response was measured and precise, a single bullet that struck Devlin in the chest and sent him sprawling in the mud of his own main street. Reynolds and his remaining men surrendered immediately, understanding that continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except their own death. The townspeople, emboldened by their oppressor's fall, quickly surrounded the hired guns and relieved them of their weapons, as Dr. Harrison knelt beside the dying Marcus Devlin, the man who had terrorized an entire community with his greed and corruption. The criminal's final words were characteristic of his selfish nature. "This should have been mine. All of it should have been mine." Zeke stood over his fallen enemy, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, only relief that the long conflict was finally over. The pistol in his hand had served its purpose one last time, but unlike his father's death years earlier, this killing had protected innocent lives rather than simply ending an abusive one. The cycle of violence that had defined too much of his life was finally broken, replaced by the possibility of building something better for the next generation. The aftermath of the gunfight brought chaos to Silver Creek's main street, as citizens struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. Marcus Devlin lay dead in the mud, his blood mixing with spring runoff from the surrounding mountains, while his hired guns sat under armed guard waiting for territorial authorities to decide their fate. But the victory came at a cost that nobody had anticipated. Jonathan Harrison knelt beside Devlin's body, his black leather medical bag open beside him as he performed the futile ritual of checking for signs of life in a man who had died instantly from Zeke's precisely placed bullet. The doctor's surgical tools gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, instruments designed to preserve life now serving as witnesses to its violent end. "He's gone," Dr. Harrison announced, closing his bag with the decisive snap of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Clean shot through the heart. He wouldn't have felt any pain. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation began to disperse. Some citizens celebrating their liberation from years of financial oppression, while others worried about the economic disruption that would follow Devlin's death. His business enterprises employed nearly half the town's residents, and his sudden demise left their future employment uncertain. Zeke holstered his father's pistol and walked toward the clinic, where Sarah was recovering, his steps heavy with the weight of what he had just done. Killing in war was one thing, killing in self-defense was another. But executing a man in front of an entire community carried moral complexities that would haunt him regardless of the circumstances that had made it necessary. Inside the clinic, he found Sarah propped up in bed with her arm in a sling, her face pale but alert as she listened to reports from the street. Billy Henderson sat beside her, having appointed himself her guardian, while his mother dealt with the aftermath of their rescue. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, as Zeke entered the room. "Devlin's dead. His men surrendered. The territorial marshal is on his way to sort out the legal details. But yes, it's over." Relief flooded Sarah's features, followed immediately by concern as she studied Zeke's expression. "How do you feel about it?" Zeke sat heavily in the chair beside her bed, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years, empty, tired, glad it's finished, but not particularly proud of how it ended. Dr. Harrison entered the room carrying his medical bag, his expression grave as he prepared to examine Sarah's wound. The surgical instruments within represented his life's work, tools dedicated to healing rather than harming, to preserving life rather than ending it. The bullet passed clean through without hitting bone or major blood vessels, he reported after carefully removing Sarah's bandages. "You were fortunate. A few inches in any direction, and we might be having a very different conversation." As he cleaned and redressed the wound with practiced efficiency, Dr. Harrison shared news from his examination of the scene outside. "Captain Reynolds is talking freely now that his employer is dead. Seems Devlin was planning to expand his operations throughout the territory, using the bounty on your heads as a way to eliminate witnesses who might interfere with his larger criminal enterprises. What happens to his businesses?" Sarah asked, wincing as the doctor adjusted her bandages. "The territorial authorities will have to sort that out, but I suspect many of his properties were obtained through fraudulent means, which could mean they revert to their rightful owners. Your husband's mining claims, for instance, were probably never legally Devlin's to begin with. The implications were staggering. If Devlin's fraudulent acquisitions were reversed, dozens of families might recover property they had lost through his manipulation. The economic disruption would be significant, but the restoration of stolen wealth could ultimately strengthen the community's financial foundation. "There's something else," Dr. Harrison continued as he packed his instruments away. "The territorial governor has declared that all bounties posted by Devlin are null and void, given the evidence of his criminal activities. You're both free to resume normal lives without fear of legal prosecution." Sarah reached for Zeke's hand, squeezing it gently as she processed the magnitude of their changed circumstances. After months of living as hunted criminals, they could now walk openly in any town throughout the territory. "What about the baby?" she asked the doctor. "Did the shooting or the wound cause any complications?" Dr. Harrison smiled for the first time since the confrontation. "I can detect a strong, steady heartbeat. Your child seems to have inherited your resilience. With proper rest and nutrition, I see no reason why you shouldn't carry to full term without difficulties." Billy Henderson, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention of a child who had witnessed more violence than anyone his age should experience, spoke up with characteristic directness. "Are you and Mr. Zeke going to get married now that the bad man is dead?" Sarah and Zeke looked at each other, both realizing that they had been so focused on survival that they had never formally discussed the legal aspects of their relationship. "Would you like us to?" Sarah asked the boy. "Yes, Lima says people who love each other should get married so their babies have proper families." "Your mother is a wise woman," Zeke said, turning to Sarah with an expression that mixed love with lingering uncertainty. "What do you think?" ready to make this official. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church at the heart of Silver Creek, with nearly the entire town in attendance to witness the union of two people whose story had become local legend. Sarah wore a simple white dress that accommodated her growing pregnancy, while Zeke had traded his mountain man clothing for a proper suit that made him look like a different person, entirely civilized, respectable, and thoroughly uncomfortable in the formal attire. Harrison served as Zeke's best man, while Maria Henderson stood with Sarah as her matron of honor. Billy Henderson, dressed in his finest clothes and beaming with importance, carried the rings on a small velvet pillow that his mother had sewn specifically for the occasion. The entire ceremony felt surreal after months of violence and uncertainty, yet it also represented the kind of normal life that both bride and groom had thought was beyond their reach. As autumn arrived and Sarah's pregnancy advanced, they prepared for parenthood with the methodical thoroughness that had enabled their survival during the darkest months of their conflict. The cabin was expanded to include a proper nursery, while the workshop was converted into a space where Zeke could craft the furniture and toys their child would need during its early years. Sarah spent her days creating items that would welcome their baby into the world. Her most treasured project was a blanket woven from the finest wool she could obtain, dyed in soft colors that would be suitable for either a son or daughter. The intricate pattern included symbols of protection and prosperity that her mother had taught her years earlier, ancient designs that connected their unborn child to generations of family tradition and hope. The baby's first blanket represented more than practical necessity. It embodied all of Sarah's dreams for the future they were building together. Every stitch carried her hopes for health, happiness, and the kind of secure childhood that circumstances had denied to both parents. She worked on the blanket during quiet evening hours by lamplight, her fingers moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who found peace in the ancient arts of domestic creation. "What do you think about names?" Zeke asked one evening as he watched her work on the intricate weaving. "For a boy, I'd like to honor my husband somehow. Robert was a good man who deserved to see his children grow up. Maybe Robert Ezekiel, so the baby carries both of his father's names." Zeke felt a moment's jealousy at the thought of their son bearing another man's name, followed immediately by shame at his own pettiness. Robert McKinnon had been Sarah's first love, and his memory deserved honor rather than erasure. "That sounds right," he said finally. "And for a girl, Elizabeth, after my mother. She died when I was 16, but she taught me everything I know about being strong when life becomes difficult." Dr. Harrison visited regularly during Sarah's final months, monitoring her health and the baby's development with the careful attention of someone who understood that frontier childbirth carried risks that could turn celebration into tragedy without warning. His examinations consistently showed positive signs: strong heartbeat, proper positioning, adequate nutrition despite their modest circumstances. "Everything appears normal," he reported after his weekly visit in late November. "The baby should arrive within the next 2 weeks, probably sooner rather than later given how you're carrying." Sarah had grown large enough that simple tasks like climbing stairs or bending over required assistance, but her spirits remained high as she anticipated the moment when their child would finally arrive. She had lost one baby to fever and circumstances beyond her control, making this pregnancy feel like a precious second chance that she refused to take for granted. The labor began on a snowy December morning, starting with mild contractions that gradually intensified throughout the day. Zeke sent word to Dr. Harrison, while Sarah worked through the early stages with the calm determination of someone who had prepared for this moment, both physically and emotionally. Maria Henderson arrived to assist with the birth, bringing her experience as a mother and her steady presence during difficult moments. She helped Sarah through the most challenging hours while Zeke paced the main room downstairs, feeling helpless in the face of something he could neither fight nor fix through application of force. "It's a boy," Harrison announced near midnight, holding up a small, perfect human being who announced his arrival with a lusty cry that could be heard throughout the cabin. Sarah wept with exhaustion and joy as she held her son for the first time, counting his fingers and toes while marveling at the miracle of new life. The baby had Zeke's strong features but Sarah's coloring, creating a unique combination that belonged entirely to their shared future. "Robert Ezekiel Thornton," she whispered, wrapping him in the blanket she had spent months creating. "Welcome to your family." Zeke looked down at his son, the first blood relative he had known since childhood, and felt emotions he had not known he possessed. This tiny person represented everything he had thought was impossible: family, continuity, hope for the future, and love that transcended his own survival. 1 year after their son's birth, Zeke stood in the Silver Creek courthouse holding the official deed to their mountain property, a legal document that transformed 15 years of squatters' occupation into legitimate ownership recognized by territorial and federal authorities. The deed represented more than property rights. It symbolized permanence and belonging in a world that had often treated both him and Sarah as unwelcome outsiders. The legal resolution of Devlin's criminal enterprise had taken months to untangle, but the territorial authorities had ultimately ruled that his fraudulent business practices invalidated most of his property acquisition. Families throughout the region recovered homes, businesses, and mining claims that had been stolen through manipulated contracts and fabricated debts. The economic disruption was significant, but the restoration of stolen wealth strengthened the community's foundation in ways that no amount of illegitimate prosperity could have achieved. "Congratulations, Miss Thornton," said Judge William Crawford, the territorial official who had overseen the legal proceedings. "Your mountain property is now officially yours, free and clear of any competing claims or outstanding debts." Zeke studied the official document with its ornate borders and formal language, still somewhat amazed that paper and ink could carry such weight in determining human relationships. During his years of solitude, he had owned his cabin and land through the simple act of inhabiting and improving them. Now, society had caught up with reality and granted him legal recognition for what had always been true in practical terms. Sarah waited outside the courthouse with baby Robert strapped to her chest in a carrier she had sewn from soft leather and wool. The boy had grown into a healthy, curious infant who inherited his father's size and his mother's quick intelligence. At 1 year old, he was already showing signs of the stubborn independence that had enabled both parents to survive their respective ordeals. "How does it feel to be a legitimate landowner?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the general store to purchase supplies for the coming winter. "Strange. For 15 years I owned that place because I was strong enough to defend it and stubborn enough to improve it. Now I own it because a judge signed a piece of paper. Not sure which approach makes more sense." Their marriage had settled into comfortable routines that balanced the practical demands of mountain living with the emotional requirements of family life. Sarah had proven herself capable of adapting to wilderness challenges while maintaining the domestic skills that transformed a simple cabin into an actual home. Zeke had discovered that sharing his solitary existence enhanced rather than diminished the pleasures he found in mountain life. The community's attitude toward them had evolved as well. What began as suspicion and fear had gradually transformed into respect and even admiration as people understood the true nature of their conflict with Devlin. Several other couples had sought their advice about surviving in remote locations, viewing them as examples of how determination and mutual support could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton," called a familiar voice from across the street. They turned to see Thomas McKenna approaching with a broad smile and a package wrapped in brown paper. The trapper had become their closest friend in town, serving as informal liaison between their mountain sanctuary and the broader community that had gradually accepted them as valued neighbors. "I have something for young Robert," Thomas announced, presenting the package with obvious pleasure. "Made it myself during the long winter evenings." Inside the wrapping was a carved wooden horse, complete with saddle and bridle, sized perfectly for a toddler's hand. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing the attention to detail that came from someone who truly cared about the recipient's happiness. "Thomas, this is beautiful," Sarah said, examining the toy with genuine appreciation. Robert will treasure this for years. The baby reached for the wooden horse with obvious delight, his small hands exploring the smooth surfaces and intricate details with the focused attention that characterized his approach to everything new and interesting. "Every boy needs a good horse," Thomas said, watching with satisfaction as Robert began the process of claiming his new toy. "Figured I'd start him early so he grows up understanding what it means to care for something that depends on him." As they continued their errands around town, Zeke reflected on the profound changes that had occurred in their lives over the past 2 years. He had gone from solitary hermit to husband and father, from wanted criminal to respected citizen, from someone who avoided human contact to a man who found genuine pleasure in community relationships. The transformation had not been without cost. The violence that ended their conflict with Devlin would always be part of their story, a reminder that even justified actions could carry moral complexities that would never be fully resolved. But those costs seemed small compared to the rewards they had gained through their willingness to fight for something better than mere survival. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked as they loaded their purchases into the wagon for the trip home. "How strange life can be. 2 years ago, I thought I knew exactly what my future would look like. Alone, predictable, safe. Now I can't imagine wanting to go back to that existence. Do you miss it sometimes? The simplicity of only having to worry about yourself." 5 years had passed since that desperate night in the Broken Wheel saloon, when a mountain man had gambled everything on a hand of cards and won more than he ever imagined possible. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, Zeke stood on the front porch of their expanded cabin, watching his son Robert take his first independent steps across the wooden planks, small, determined movements that carried the boy from his mother's encouraging arms toward his father's outstretched hands. Those first steps represented everything Zeke had never dared to hope for during his years of solitude. Continuity, family, a future that extended beyond his own survival. Each wobbling stride carried not just a toddler learning to navigate the physical world, but also the dreams and possibilities of parents who had built something lasting from the most unlikely beginnings. "Come on, Robert," Zeke encouraged, kneeling with his arms open as the boy approached with the single-minded focus that characterized everything he attempted. "You can do it." Sarah watched from the doorway, her hand resting on her visibly pregnant belly as she prepared to welcome their second child in the coming months. The pregnancy had been easier than her first, perhaps because stress and fear no longer dominated their daily existence. Their mountain sanctuary had become exactly what Zeke had always intended it to be, a place of peace and security where a family could grow and prosper. Robert completed his journey with a triumphant giggle, falling into his father's arms with the absolute trust that comes from never having been disappointed by the adults who shape a child's understanding of the world. At 2.5 years old, he displayed the kind of confident independence that suggested he would inherit the best qualities of both parents, while hopefully avoiding their more painful experiences. "Did you see that, Mama?" Robert called to Sarah, his vocabulary expanding daily as he worked to communicate increasingly complex thoughts and observations. "I saw everything," Sarah replied, joining them on the porch with the slow, careful movements of late pregnancy. "Pretty soon you'll be walking all the way to town by yourself. Can I ride Thunder instead?" Robert asked, referring to the gentle mare that Zeke had purchased specifically for teaching his son the fundamentals of horsemanship. "When you're bigger," Zeke promised. "Horses are powerful animals that require respect and proper preparation. But someday, yes, you'll ride Thunder wherever you want to go." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of visitors, Dr. Harrison and his wife, accompanied by a young couple that Zeke didn't recognize. The strangers carried themselves with the nervous energy of people facing uncertain circumstances, their clothing showing the wear of hard travel and limited resources. "Zeke, Sarah," Dr. Harrison called as he dismounted from his buggy. "I'd like you to meet James and Catherine Miller. They've traveled here from Kansas after hearing about your story." The Millers approached with obvious hesitation, clearly unsure about the reception they might receive from people whose reputation had grown far beyond the boundaries of Silver Creek. Stories of the mountain man and his wife, who had faced down corrupt officials and professional killers, had spread throughout the territories, attracting attention from couples facing their own seemingly impossible circumstances. "We're sorry to bother you," Catherine Miller said, her voice carrying the educated accents of someone who had fallen from more comfortable circumstances, "but we didn't know where else to turn for advice." James Miller, a man in his early 30s with the calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical labor, explained their situation with the desperate precision of someone who had rehearsed this explanation many times. "We homesteaded land in Kansas that turned out to be claimed by a railroad company through fraudulent surveys. They've hired gunmen to force us off property we legally own, and the local authorities won't help because the railroad owns them too." Sarah and Zeke exchanged glances, recognizing their own story reflected in the Millers' desperate circumstances. Corrupt, powerful interests, legal manipulation, threats of violence against people whose only crime was trying to build honest lives. The pattern was depressingly familiar. "What kind of advice are you looking for?" Sarah asked gently. "How do you fight when the odds are impossibly stacked against you?" Catherine replied, "How do you protect your family when the law won't protect you, and running away means losing everything you've worked to build?" Zeke studied the young couple, seeing in their faces the same mixture of determination and fear that he had observed in his own mirror during the darkest days of their conflict with Devlin. They possessed the kind of desperate courage that could lead to either triumph or tragedy, depending on how they channeled their energy and resources. "The first thing you need to understand," he said finally, "is that fighting corrupt power requires more than just individual courage. You need allies, evidence, and a plan that turns their strength against them." "We can't offer you guarantees," Sarah added, "but we can share what we learned about surviving when survival seems impossible."